Hi, everyone. So we're going to get started in about a minute or so. So hopefully you guys have had a chance to get yourselves ready to go here. Okay, so just some general stuff. As far as if you guys have questions, I won't necessarily be able to see them all as I'm doing the presentation, but if you leave them for the end, we'll have some time to go through some of the user questions, and then anything that we don't have time to get to, I'll make sure that we get a response back to you through email. So yeah, so this presentation is talking about best practices for model groups. So I'm Michelle Ovelson. I work with Summit Technologies as a BIM consultant. So below we have our a link to our blog. This session is being recorded, and we will upload it onto our YouTube channel and provide a link to it on our blog. So in case you somebody missed it and would like to see the webinar, this can be sent to them that way. So other than that, we're just going to dive right in here. So this first slide. So anybody who has worked with model groups has probably seen this warning come up, and it's probably also been a little bit of your nemesis, because this thing seems to always show up, and it's hard to know what you may have done to cause Revit to say that it needs to fix your groups. And when it does that, it duplicates groups, causes big problems. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is just going through ways to plan out your groups, take some time to really think about what's going to go in your groups. We're going to go through some best practices for what those things are that will go in your groups and how to organize them. We're also going to be talking about some ways that you can reduce the chance of getting this warning. Unfortunately, with model groups, you might find that you'll do something and it'll work 90% of the time, and then that 10% Revit won't like something and it'll want to fix your group. So I've included in this presentation some examples of that so that you can kind of be a little more proactive about hopefully reducing the number of times you have to deal with this. And then the final part of the presentation is going to be on how to deal with this warning when you get it. So what do you do? Do you hit cancel? Do you fix the groups? How does that work? So we'll be going through that as well. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is planning out your groups. So the best thing to do for your project is just to take some time, take a step back, and take a holistic look at your building and what you're going to need for groups, for model groups. So a lot of times when people start out with a building, especially if this is residential, that they'll group a suite together. You'll think suite equals group. So a lot of times I want to get people to just take a step back and not only just look at the suite, but also take a look at the commonalities between the buildings. So some examples of that, I'm going to go over here to Revit. So to planning out your groups here. So this is just a little not well done, well structured architectural plan. So don't take too much time to critique my layout styles. Just a couple to give you guys an idea of things here. So these are three groups. So it looks to here that, you know, this one and this one over here are the same, and this one's a different group. But now, if let's say you have a project that has 8 suite types or 8 groups, but you only maybe have 1 or 2 washroom types. The danger with just grouping an entire suite together would mean that if you have 8 different suites, but only 2 washroom types, if you make a change to that washroom, you might be doing that 2 or 3 or 4 times instead of just having that as a separate group. So if you see here, you might want to consider creating the washroom in itself as its own group. Then you can place that one into the suite locations where they exist, and then you only have one group to manage and to make changes on versus having to have an entire suite to make those changes on. Okay, so it's just taking some time to take a step back, to not just group stuff together because they're a chunk of something, but think about what's different, what's the same within your building, and kind of planning from there. So So the next part of that is dealing with exterior, corridor, and party walls. So going back over to Revit here, a lot of questions that come up are also related to what goes in your groups. So this one I've heard a few different, some people like to do it this way, some people don't, but this is kind of my preferred method. I don't like to have exterior walls, party walls, or corridor walls in groups, just for the fact that there's a lot of instances where these can be different. So for example, if you take a look at this group here, that's the same as this one over here, we have different wall conditions. So you have a group that has a party wall on one side, you have another one that has an exterior wall. Over here, you might have exterior mixed with a stair. So then you have to start, it might have seemed really simple at the beginning of design when you just are blocking out portions, but when you start to put more detail into your project, you'll start to notice that now, oh, do I have to duplicate this group because I have a different wall situation? And that can start to get a little bit confusing. So that's why I generally like to have those outside. Now, a lot of people might be saying, well, what about design? Where you have, this is where what you use as starting blocks. So you might have some suite types and then you want to be able to move these entire boxes up, down, and around to populate, to develop your building shape. So that's okay. If you want to start out in design with those walls being part of your group, just so you can start boxing out your shape, then that's fine. That's a great way to set up your building. Just keep in mind as things progress into construction documentation, it might be best to take those out of your group so that you can start making those changes to those wall types and not have it multiply or affect your groups. Okay, so the next thing is hosted families. So generally best practice, if you have a hosted family, meaning something that's wall hosted, face-based, floor-based, ceiling-based, anything like that, you also want that host to be in the group as well. So for example, if we have this suite here, if you want this door to be part of this suite, you have to include the wall as well. Otherwise, Revit's going to, there's a greater chance that it's going to give you some struggles with that. It doesn't really like when you have things outside. So again, best practice to keep things, if you want to bring that host in, then keep things inside there as well. This is why I also don't like to see a lot of host-based families. Like I don't like to see casework as being wall hosted. You might think that it's going to save you time because then if your wall moves, the casework moves. But the trouble with that is now if this wall moves and it's not part of the group, it's now affecting how your group functions, and Revit's going to want to try to fix your groups, and it's going to cause you all sorts of problems. And it might just limit how you have to organize your groups. Now, instead of having the option to not include your walls, you kind of get directed down a path where you have to have them because all your content's been set up that way. So I really like to prefer having most of the content not hosted where possible. Obvious examples, you need to have things like windows and doors, but anything else, try to limit that as much as possible. Okay. So the next item I want to talk about is nesting groups within other groups. So generally, we want to avoid doing this. This usually ends up being kind of a common thing that happens when people start developing their models. In that instance of your washroom layout here, you might start to notice that, hey, this washroom needs to be its own group because it's being used in multiple suite types. So in that case, I'll just take that group, nest it into other groups, and keep going on my way. So problem with that is it does require more processing time for Revit. And then just in general, whenever you have to edit, if I just want to edit this washroom group, I have to first go into the host group, then I have to go into this group, hit yes. I mean, it's minor time, but that time's going to add up as you're working on your project. And it doesn't really gain you a whole lot of benefit. So if you go in and edit this group now, you can click it and say okay, but the trouble is that that makes, because this is nested in to your overall suite group, it's also in Revit's mind, it has to think about how that affected the other group and if it has to make changes. And again, it's just a little bit more of a process for it. Makes things a little more complicated, greater chance to get that fixed warnings. So generally I like to see something like this, where you have maybe your suite A as a group, and then you also have your washroom as a separate group. And so you might have a suite that maybe has one or two groups within that suite that you're then copying around and moving around. Not to say that this is an absolute, maybe again, in the beginning when you're doing design, you might nest some of this stuff in just to get stuff multiplied and placed, but this isn't something that you want to continue throughout the duration of your project, because once that, in design it might be fine because there aren't a lot of elements and complications going on in your model, but as the model progresses, gets more elements in it, gets potentially more warnings, more slowdown, we want to make this as lean of a process as you possibly can, just so that you avoid problems down the road, especially when those problems seem to happen right around deadlines and time when you really don't have time to deal with it or fix it. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to talk about is the option of using nested families over groups. So this can be a great option just to save you guys some time. So an example of that would be things that are kind of self-contained that move together as one object. So a lot of times a good candidate for this could be your kitchen layouts. And again, similar idea with the nesting of the washroom. If you have 8 suite types, but you only have 2 or 3 kitchen layouts, then you could create that as one nested family, that entire kitchen layout, and place those in the suites that you want, and just completely bypass the group as an option. So if you keep it as part of the group, then just to edit it, you have to go edit group, then you go in, you move your items, whatever you have to do. Now, if you go with just a nested family option, this is a way for you to completely bypass the group tool completely. So the idea behind this is that then you can go and edit this family instead of having to edit the group. Go into that family, make your change, move your stuff around, bring it back in, override it, and then you see it's not going to it doesn't have to process the changes to the groups. Now, this is only something at the beginning in design. Again, you might want to follow where you have these nested families placed in your group so that you can populate them quickly. So you can copy those up levels and get them all into the place that they want to be in. But once you have it, you're 70%, 50% into design, whatever it is, where you're thinking, these guys aren't really going to be moving their location that much. The design is pretty much set. Maybe things are going to happen as far as, this countertop's going to move out a bit more. We're maybe going to add some pieces, but the location is generally in the right spot. You then have the option to just take that out of the group, and then you don't have to, if you want to edit this kitchen layout, you can go into your family, make the changes, load it in, and then that's one time where there's zero chance of having to fix your groups because you just bypass the groups entirely. So that's also a great option if you want to be able to skip your groups. But again, it's something to kind of consider with how it all depends on how your project is changing. You always have to account for design changes. I've heard of many projects that are supposed to be really simple with only a few groups, a few suite types, and then changes happen and those numbers multiply. So it's trying to kind of set these up in the most organized way as possible, but also accounting that there might be a little bit of change. So it's your call to make the best decision on when this might start to become more final, because then that's usually also the time when your model has a lot more in it. You have a lot more details done. The file size is starting to get a bit bigger. That's a lot of the times when you can start to see some processing warnings. So if you can take that out of the group, that might save you some time. It also might give you some more consistency with not having to fix your groups. Okay, so the next one is groups and walls. So it's really important to disallow the joins to all of the walls that are not part of your group. The reason for this is, especially if these groups exist in other, if they're attaching to other groups. So let's say we have this condition here. If I go in and draw a wall that attaches and joins to that other wall, Revit doesn't always, oh, apologies here, I had that preset here. So allow join. So if I have this preset to allow the joins, in Revit's mind, it can sometimes think that that means you're trying to change this other group. And that means that sometimes it might not like that, and it will try to, it'll give you a warning. Once you finish this group, it'll say it wants to fix your other group because you made a change to it, and it can't work that out. And now this instance of the group is different from all the others. So again, if I hit finish right now, it's going to be fine. And that's where model groups are kind of tricky, because again, 80% of the time it might be perfectly fine, but those other percent, that other 20% of the time, it might tell you to fix your groups. So there's a risk involved when you go against some of these best practices. It might be fine, but then you can't guarantee that it won't be. So it's always best to kind of assume that it won't be, and then you don't have to worry about it if it does happen. So what you want to do for a lot of these walls, you have a couple options. You can allow the join here and then just right click on this button here to say disallow. And then you move it to butt up to that other wall. There was one case where I worked with a client who had a very similar situation to this, where they were editing and adding a wall that was joining, it was joining up with a corner of another group. And just the fact that they first allowed the join and then did the disallow, it was still giving them a fixed groups warning. So we just tried for fun. When they went to go redraw this wall, instead of allowing the join and then disallowing it and moving it, if you preset this to disallow, it saves you a step because you don't have to right click disallow the join. So preset that to disallow and then draw it across. And then it never makes that connection with that group. And in that instance with that client, that made it not want to fix groups. So it solved that warning. Again, that was the only time. There were 9 out of 10 times where that didn't happen, but there was one time where it did, and that was an issue. So if you can, it's a little bit tricky to remember, but when you're working inside your groups, make sure you change this join set to disallow, especially when it's going up against other groups, and even more especially when it's connecting into corners. All right. The next thing I want to talk about is the top constraint on walls. So this is the only time that I tell my clients not to add a top constraint. That means assigning it to a top level with your walls for ones that are in a group, and especially if these are getting copied from level to level and those levels potentially have different heights, because Revit's not going to work well with that. So I have an example over here of this. So I'm just going to go to an elevation view to get this started. So just going to edit this group. And so let's say if we've gone through and connected them up to level 2 and given them an offset down below, the problem is when you copy those up to another level, if you have a different height there, Revit's not really sure what to do because it's trying to connect to the level, but the height isn't the same, and it's a problem. So what Revit will allow you to do is to select these walls and attach them to a floor. Now, when you click on these walls, it's still going to give you an unconnected height of 3000, even though that height is actually going up all the way to your floor. But Revit doesn't have a problem with then copying and pasting that around to other groups. Now, the other thing to note for this, the order is important here. So if I do that to one instance of my group, and I go in and attach this to the floor, it does not adjust the other ones. So this attach tool is kind of instance-based. So if you can remember, and this is one of those hard things to get the order right, as you're creating your walls, it's best to go in and attach the first one and then copy them around, because it's going to keep, I'm sorry here, copy that around because it's going to keep that level attached to that floor. Same kind of idea with the next floor. So if you go up, if you copy this and paste it to your next level, now if I attach to this floor, again, it's not going to update any of these other ones, which almost starts to make sense, because if this tried to move up in the same amount, you'd have the same problem where now you have a big gap here and, oh, you need to create another group because they're different wall heights. So this is kind of the reason why it works that way, because then that allows you to go into this group, attach up to a completely different height, and Revit's going to let you do that. So then you can go around and copy those around, and they will be attached to the level. And then as you change this height, it's allowing you, oh, I missed 2 walls in there. Sorry there. It's allowing you to connect those up to those different levels. Okay. Oh, just some walls in behind there. Okay, so next thing is the group origin point. So this is something with the groups that, again, is kind of an afterthought for a lot of times. So you'll see a lot of groups that just have origins. I believe I have some in here that are just in the middle. That's usually what you end up seeing. So it is really important to move these origin points to a location that makes sense. Now, whether this is, I don't generally recommend to put this to the finished faces of walls, because, you know, sometimes those walls are changing thickness and finishes are changing. So if you can move it to the intersection of, say, say you have a grid line here and here, that's a little bit more consistent, because that's kind of a more important marker that's not going to be moving around and varying a lot. So you want to set your origin point, just even for the reason that you can place these model groups. You don't always have to copy and paste model groups around. There is a way to place them just within the architecture tab. So you can select here, go place model group, and then if you did set your origin properly, you can place it without having to copy and paste on whatever level you want it to, and have it go into the right spot. This is also really good for detail components. So if you created a detail group of a typical roof to wall connection or something like that, make sure you put that origin point in a location that you can easily snap to, so that if you have to place that on another detail, you can snap it to the core of the wall and the top slab of the roof or something like that. So it makes it a little bit easier to go in place, rather than trying to always copy paste and then shuffle it around to the right spot after the fact. Okay, so the next thing is try to avoid using groups for one instance. This is something that I see being extremely common, but it's just something that, especially if you're using a lot of groups, something you want to use sparingly, because you're already kind of increasing your process time with having all of these groups going on. There's a lot more groups to manage as far as just naming convention and knowing what they are. So if you have groups coming in that are just single instances. A lot of times people like to do that because they say things like it's easier to select them, it's easier to isolate them for editing and all that stuff. So just keep in mind that there is extra time added on to creating a group. I mean, it's very minor where you have to go in, say edit group, and accept those changes and kind of click around a little bit. But all of those, seconds can add up over the building. So if you're not gaining any efficiency by using the group tool, which is, having multiple instances and having changes populate those instances, then it's a little bit harder to start to justify the extra processing time and the extra time it spends just editing the group and then waiting for the wheel to turn a little bit while it accepts those changes. So in general, I like to see, if you can, there are other ways that you can kind of isolate and select things. So if you want to just see a certain list of items in here and isolate them for editing, you have a few tools available to you. So you can always use your temporary hide isolate. So if you want to just isolate certain elements and work with them independently of others, you can use that. You also have, if you want to be able to see some of this stuff in 3D and isolate it and edit it, again, you can use this section box up here. And that will isolate those items for you to view in 3D and edit if you need to. So I'm just saying oh, and the other reason was I see it a lot in detail groups. So sometimes they like to say that it makes it more clear because you can see what the detail components and lines are versus the model element. So you can also control that with visibility graphics. You also have a display model option in your view properties where you could halftone the model so that you could see your detail components show up full with the full line weights. But just be aware too that when you are adjusting those visibility graphics, you probably want to have some working views or to use the enable temporary view properties. So what this allows you to do is you can go in, you can make it halftone while you make your edits, but then when you restore, it has no effect on your view template or on the ones that go on sheets. So you don't have to worry that you just did that, you just half-toned your model and it went out to print at the same time or something like that. This is a temporary way to control your views. So that can also be a good option that can kind of mitigate the use of that kind of stuff. So I like to just basically, I don't say don't use it, well, stop using them as much as possible. But if you do find a justified use for it, just make sure that you've kind of thought about it and you're using it sparingly where you can. So on to some of the more strange things within the model groups, which I'm sure if any of you guys have worked with them, you guys have all found things that are kind of weird. So sketch-based elements. So this came up with a client where they were adding, it was either floor finishes to a suite or ceilings to a suite. And if they were editing the suite and then drawing the floor, I'll just put a little whatever floor there, and they hit OK, that was telling them, oh, highlighted floors overlap, ignore that. That was telling them to fix groups. Just by creating that sketch-based item within the group was enough for Revit to kind of glitch out and not like that. So the way around that was that just going to go back here. So for sketch-based items, you're going to find a little bit more consistency if you create the sketch first and then just simply add it to your group after the fact. Okay, so again, it's kind of weird, doesn't always make sense that Revit would have an issue of that, and 9 times out of 10 it won't, but there were instances that I've had to deal with clients where they say that it wants to fix their groups. So just something to be aware of, that if you can kind of create those outside and then add them in later, there seems to be more consistency in Revit kind of accepting that. So the next one is mirror ceiling groups. So this is a known issue that Autodesk is working on, and I added a little, it's lovely when you hear that, because At some point it will get fixed, but it still has not been an issue. I tried it again in 2018 and it's still showing up. And this is only for mirrored groups. This is not just specific to ceilings. This is more related to surface patterns. But where this comes up a lot is on ceiling plans. So right here, I've got a ceiling group. Now, if I copy this ceiling group over here, you'll see that the pattern is in the right spot. They're both lining up. If I align this pattern, one sec here. Oh, sorry, edit the group, align the pattern to move it. It moves them both and they're still lined up. Now, if you take this group and mirror it, you see what happened there. Now we've got a line here that's off from this one over here. And you might fight with yourself all day. If you move it over here, it moves it over there. So this is that known issue. So if you are grouping together, let's say common wings or portion of your building with ceilings, if you mirror it, and this again, it works for anything, not just ceilings, any surface pattern that you are mirroring across, it's not going to show a consistent alignment of your pattern. So just something to be aware of and work around and try and plan for versus seeing it happen and then trying to be reactive after the fact. Okay. The next issue that we kind of come across every once in a while is related to hosted families and the ceilings. So if you guys have ever worked with ceilings and you've placed, some either ceiling-based components or some face-based components, you might get instances where weird things happen. So I've seen where all of a sudden, you're placing things and you're moving things around, and then you'll see something like that where it just moved out into space. Or you'll see instances where certain ones get deleted, and it's very strange sometimes. So I was doing a bit of research on this because it's again one of those things that's really hard to recreate. But what I had found, thanks to Steve Stafford's blog, was if you make edits to your group, so you move something around, or you delete or add something, by selecting all of the elements and doing a nudge up and a nudge down, that is supposed to solve that issue. And again, it was hard to test and recreate because it's kind of one of those things that you have to have the issue first and then kind of undo and then try this. So that's an option to you guys if you're finding that you did something to your ceiling and all of a sudden something deleted, something's not acting right. Do an undo, go back before you make your change again, but then before you hit that checkbox, nudge up, nudge down, and hopefully you will have some, it seems like such a silly solution, but hopefully that will give you maybe a little more consistency with some of these weird glitches that we've seen with the model groups. Okay, so those are some ways to kind of proactively avoid those different warnings and different glitches. But I want to talk a little bit more about the fixed groups warnings and specifically what you need to do when this happens. So just going to scroll back up to this warning again. So it's basically saying that group instances, for some reason, there's an inconsistency. It no longer thinks that they're the same. So if you hit cancel, it just puts you back into group edit mode, and you either have to undo what you did and try again, or you have the option to fix groups. Sometimes you also have the option to ungroup. I don't ever recommend ungrouping. So what you can do is go to, I'm just going to go over here and kind of recreate it on the floor plans here. So basically what it's doing here is I'm going to get rid of this, and we're going to go edit this. So we've edited this group, made a change, and now what's happened is we're going to go edit type. When it says fix groups, what that means that it's doing is it's duplicating the group. So we've got, you'll get an instance after you're done where it's going to say Suite A2. And now it's just duplicated your group. So the trouble is, once that happens, you've fixed your groups. You're not really sure what groups it fixed. I mean, you could go through the list in the warning and check all that, but sometimes it's just like, okay, what do we do now? Now we've got these extra groups and we're not sure what to do. So you don't have to ungroup any of these things. The beauty with Revit is that it works with types and instances. So the same way you have a wall and maybe somebody duplicated it and created it as a different wall, you can just change it back to that original wall. The same idea applies here to these groups. It went and it changed your group to a different type. So you just need to change it back to that original type. Now, the second part of this problem is finding all of those groups that it changed. So there's two ways to go through that. You can either select the group, right-click, find all instances in entire project. It's going to find them all, and then you just go over here, change it back to Suite A. Or you go through your project browser, expand your model groups. Same thing, select all instances visible in entire project. Go to your type properties, switch it back to Suite A. And then you're good to go. You've moved them back to that Suite A group. So whatever Revit thought was different, you just replace it back to your Suite A groups. Then just make sure and go back and check that if there are no more instances of this, you can then go in and delete it, which I like to do because then it keeps your model list nice and clean. And then you're good to go. So that will work most of the time to fix up those group warnings. So now this is why naming convention is really important. A lot of times when I'll look at models, you'll see a lot of things like group 2, group 1. You might even see things where they do say Suite A2 because somebody was in a hurry, they needed to add something to a group to make another one, so they just duplicated the group. And now we've got Suite A2. So by not taking time to rename your group, you've basically just created another group that's hard to distinguish if it was meant to be duplicated or if it was just that Revit fixed groups and now somebody needs to go in and fix them. So what can happen is, maybe that if a fixed group wasn't fixed right away and switched back to Suite A, somebody might see this and say, oh, there's a Suite A2 that must have been a fixed group. I better go in and grab them all and move them to the other Suite A and delete it. And they just deleted the group that you meant to create and change. So, I mean, a lot of that can happen with communication. You can tell your team that you're making that group, but it's a lot easier just to take some time to rename this group. And instead of adding a 2 to it, you say maybe Suite A with shaft, or explain how it's different. That, to me, is a lot more clear to understand why there are 2 groups there versus just adding numbers to it, which makes it a lot harder to manage. Okay, and speaking of managing groups, so I very much so recommend that if you guys are doing a project with a lot of groups, that you have a team member that's kind of keeping an eye on them, checking for certain things. So what I usually do when I'm looking at groups is I'll go through these in a 3D view. My 3D view is going to look a little weird because I've got things floating all over the place, but go to 3D view, right click, use the project browser because it's going to give you every instance of the groups that you have. Select all instances in entire project. It's going to highlight where those groups are. It's going to give you a count in the filter so you know that there are 2 instances of that group. And also if you're working in an enclosed building, which you're doing most of the time, you can use your isolate. So you isolate elements and then you can go in here and take a look at what's in that group. Are there things that shouldn't have been in there? Is there some red flag that's showing up with how people have been organizing the groups? But it can give you a nice understanding of what groups are being used in the project and what their use are for. So you can go through and do that. The other thing that I also really like to do is just going to move this guy over to Suite A here. So let's say we select all instances in entire project and it says 0. That's another way to understand that maybe does this group need to be purged out? Is it no longer required? Kind of finding out just a little bit of cleanup so that you can get rid of some groups that you might not need. The other thing that I always like to check for is if you select instances and you only see one of them. Again, another red flag to show that, you know, people are using a lot of groups where they might not need to be, just to group things together that are single instances. So that can also be based on how you guys decide you want to handle your processes for groups. That can be a way to kind of manage how single instances are getting used. Then otherwise, from a management point, I like to have a nice strong naming convention in place. Definitely think general to specific. So if you have a lot of different groups, think of how they're all similar and go generic. So if you have groups related to suites, begin every group with suite. If you have groups related to roof items, group them all with roof prefix, just so that they're very easy to find if people do decide to kind of be placing stuff through this way. It's a little more clear as to what they are and what they're being used for. Okay. So that is my my recommendations, my issues that I've found with groups. I'm just going to pull up some of these questions because we'll have some time to go through them. Okay. Okay, so I see here I've got a couple comments. One from Mohammed, who's a BIM Council member. Thank you for attending. I see here with a yes, low volume. So hopefully the volume wasn't too low. I had it sound checked before, so if this was consistently low, then I apologize. Hopefully it wasn't too low. How do we avoid getting messages to ungroup the groups or Revit creating new groups? So this was said at 12:10, so I did go over that after your question. So if you have anything to expand on that, then please do so. So I'll give you guys a couple minutes. If anybody has any other questions they want to throw out, then I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, while we're waiting for that, I'm just gonna just say that, yeah, this webinar will be recorded or is being recorded. So if you'd like to refer back to it at a later time, we can, the link will go up on our BIM blog, which is the website here. And then we also have a YouTube channel. So if you'd like to check out any other webinars and videos that we've done in the past, you can find them there. Okay, so I see, have another question, please. Yeah, please go ahead and type it out, and then I can respond. Okay. Okay, so here we go. Do you recommend using detail annotation groups as well and or in combination with model groups? Okay, so this is probably referring to the fact that you can attach detail groups to your model groups. And I've only done this once or twice. I used to do this with projects so that you could then show consistent dimensioning and annotation. The problem that I really had with that one was that it involved using a lot of reference planes to some extent, because, for example, if you want to attach any detail within here, it has to exist within this model and has to have everything referenced within it. So where that becomes an issue is with dimensioning to things that aren't part of the group. That can be things like your walls that aren't going to be part of the group. So if you create a dimension in here and try to attach that to this group, it's going to give you a warning. So to get around that, we had a lot of reference planes, which was a terrible idea and caused a lot of mess for what we found the benefit to be. So it's not something that I generally would recommend. I would say instead to maybe to kind of plan out how your working drawings are going to be built up, and just generally avoid duplication of annotations where possible. save those large amounts of dimensionings for your enlarged suite plans versus showing them on your overall plans. Picking where you want to show where the tags come up, that kind of thing. So I mean, it can be done, but just to kind of just make sure that you use it sparingly so that you don't find that you're having to add a lot to your model groups to suit your annotations that might not be giving you the biggest reward back. Next question here, how to set up the model progress to view sets and then sheet sets and publish, since I'm going to add all the annotations, tags, etc. in sheet sets. If I modify the model, then automatically updated. Okay, so this is related to publishing. Are you publishing views up to BIM 360? Are you printing? Are you exporting? I might need a little bit more clarification on that, and then I might need to, just because it's a little outside of model groups and detail groups, I can get back to you. Export, publish in PDF. So this is just, yeah, so dealing with printing, I can toss that in here because it's not too bad. With anything that you guys are trying to export or print, you can save sets within a few different ways. So you can do selected views and sheets. So this is a way that I don't have any sheets in here, but down in this Dropbox down here, you can say that these are, you can limit, yeah, your name of what you want. So you do a save as in here. This down here will select whether it's sheets or views. So if you're doing a print set, you probably just want your sheets. If you do a save as on this, you can create this as your CD 75% or client review or whatever it's going to be. And then if you save it there, you can have a list of those sets to refer back to. So I always like to have a few saved up for different requirements, whether it's internal, sending out to clients or anything like that. And same idea with the export is a very similar process. So you would go to the CAD formats. You'll find a similar example where you create the set, make sure you do a save as to save them, and then you can use them again. What about groups of detail lines and detail items? I often avoid making the two groups one model and one detail based. This has been problematic, or do you have a suggestion on use? Groups of detail lines and detail items. So just creating detail groups. I often avoid making the two groups. Okay, I'm a little confused on that. So you're creating, is this still related to the topic of creating model groups and then having that annotation detail group, or are you talking about creating, using for details, section details, creating detail groups that way? And Abdul, with regard to your question, yes, I can definitely email you if you want to go over in more detail, creating up some of those sets. We can email you and get that sorted. When you try to group model elements and detail groups together. Okay, so that's still related to that attaching detail groups to your model group. Avoid making two groups, one model, one detail based. Matthew, I might have to get your contact information and have that be a separate discussion, just so I can get a clear understanding of what you're trying to do, and then we can go through different options for what might be the best best way to go forward with that. All right, so if there are no other questions, again, you can feel free to contact us anytime after this webinar. If you do have additional questions or anything like that, then we can get in touch again. So otherwise, thank you very much for taking your time out today to attend. I hope you were able to learn a couple of things about the particularities of the model groups, and hopefully you'll be able to attend our next ones in the future. So have a great Friday, and thank you guys very much.